the same question or you see a question that you really want answered. And participants on Facebook Live can post their questions in the comments. And please do identify yourself and your affiliation when asking your questions. The event is being recorded and it'll be posted on the site afterwards. And also just as a note that this is a true dialogue and the comments and opinions shared here do not necessarily reflect the views of the US government or the Parliamentary Centre. But it's my pleasure to invite Senior Advisor Lynn Sycade, Director of the Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the State Department to give some opening remarks. Lynn.
Thank you, Tom. Distinguished panelists and guests, it's great to be here with you today. I'm delighted to share some thoughts on how the US State Department, under the priorities of the Biden administration, is working to build back a better democracy in spite of the challenges that we've faced over the last year and a half. This is focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know the pandemic has led to democratic backsliding around the globe. Under the guise of a global emergency, authoritarian governments have violated the rights of their people, suppressed information, curtailed civil liberties, and they've used the COVID-19 pandemic to restrict access to services for vulnerable populations, such as LGBTQI+ persons and persons with disabilities. Among other things, state actors have used this crisis as a justification to censor the media. Over the past year and a half, we've seen governments use the pandemic as an excuse to limit access to information, to restrict freedom of expression, and to criminalize the work of both individuals and institutions for their involvement with independent media. We strongly support the Media Freedom Coalition that was forged by Canada and the United Kingdom in 2019, and we'll work with them and with other member states of the coalition to strengthen our collective approach to a sustainable and independent media, which is so important for both accountability and for accurate information. We'll also work to advance media freedom bilaterally in numerous other venues like the UN and the Freedom Online Coalition. We are also very pleased to see the G7 tackle media freedom in its Open Society Working Group. Now, many authoritarian leaders have also used the COVID-19 pandemic as a justification to restrict access to services for vulnerable populations. During public emergencies, such as the one we face with COVID, governments have a responsibility to protect all people. So the restrictions on services, as well as restrictions on movement, have made it increasingly difficult for members of at-risk ethnic, racial, and religious groups. Restrictions on movement have also brought an increased risk of domestic violence. On this, government should work closely with civil society to ensure they're protecting all people and minimizing risks for vulnerable populations during these times. It's always important, but COVID has really made it a little bit more dire. Lastly, we're concerned with the misuse of emergency declarations and mass surveillance technologies during the pandemic. Numerous governments have used the pandemic as a way to postpone or cancel elections, to further monitor citizens and to silence voices. And on this, transparency and accountability, it's vital for democratic societies and significantly important if we're going to help people who live in authoritarian governments. We will continue to work with international partners to promote these ideals and are inclined to encourage other governments to do something like this surveillance human rights due diligence document we did, which says to companies that export surveillance items that they need to take a hard look at where they're sending them and who the end user of that product would be. Now, some governments have also used the pandemic as an excuse to limit the exercise of freedom of association and freedom of assembly. I'm not going to go too much further into all of that because I know the panelists will also speak about this. So let me just say that in the US, we know that successful democracies require certain features: strong civil society, free and fair elections, inclusive political participation, government accountability, and independent media. And these are only a few of the things that are needed. We also know that successful democracies, when they provide these things, are more stable and they're more prosperous countries. And that's why President Biden and Secretary Blinken have placed human rights and democracy at the heart of US foreign policy. So what does that mean? The Department of State will address human rights and democracy bilaterally and multilaterally and through programs here in DRL, such as the Global Equality Fund and Lifeline. Where there have been serious human rights violations, we'll consider the application of sanctions, such as the Global Magnitsky Law, among others. Along with DRL, USAID focuses on several key areas in the democracy and human rights field: democratic governance, participation and inclusion, free and fair elections, transparency and accountability, civil society and independent media, justice and security, human rights and non-discrimination, and countering resurgent authoritarian influence. Now, President Biden has also said that we must lead by the power of our example. So the US government has focused on our own COVID response and on rebuilding our own democracy. As we seek to work abroad, we'll focus on rebuilding alliances and recommitting ourselves to the work. We do hope that the Summit for Democracy can be a help to all of our countries as we seek to improve. I really value the opportunity to take part in this discussion, to hear from human rights scholars and activists, from parliamentarians from around the world. I thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cade. If I could just get everyone to have a look at your camera and give a little smile, and we'll take a very quick picture on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Now to our panelists. We open by setting the stage on the changing and changed landscape of global democracy with Freedom House's Vice President of Research and Analysis, Sarah Repucci. Ms. Repucci oversees Freedom House's flagship publications, Freedom in the World, Freedom on the Net, and Nations in Transit. She played an instrumental role in the creation and launch of the highly regarded initiatives, including Democracy Under Lockdown, a major report to examine threats to democracy posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Following Sarah's presentation, we'll look inwards at how democracy support community should respond to the new landscape. Thomas Carothers, Interim President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and is widely recognized as a leading authority on democratization and international support for democracy. He's worked on democracy and governance assistance programs around the world for many public and private organizations. Building on Sarah's analysis and his deep bench of research in the area, Dr. Carothers will offer insight on how democracy support community can respond to these new challenges. After Tom, we'll turn to Dr. Jennifer Piscopo, Associate Professor of Politics at Occidental College in Los Angeles, California. As you know, Canada has had a feminist international assistance policy since 2018 and is now looking towards creating a feminist foreign policy. Understanding how feminist approaches can be applied in the area of democracy support is a brand new field that we at the Parliamentary Center are giving special attention to. Dr. Piscopo will help guide us through this based on her experience as a prolific author on the topic. Jen recently spoke before the UN General Assembly. Member states convened for the Commission on the Status of Women on feminist approaches to building back better, and we're honored to have her speak with us today. Finally, we'll bring the conversation back home towards Canada with our final speaker, Dr. Christopher Sands, Director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Dr. Sands is an internationally renowned specialist on Canada-US relations. He's also an adjunct professor of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. He regularly gives testimony at the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament, and he'll offer insight on Canada's potential unique contribution in the field of democracy support and how this can not only advance shared values, but be of strategic benefit to Canadian interests as well. Okay, well, without further ado, let's jump right in, and I would invite Sarah to give us some opening remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, and to all of my colleagues here, and to all of you for being here today. So for anyone who isn't familiar, Freedom House is an organization that supports the widening and deepening of democracy around the world. We do research that I will be discussing today, but we also do overseas programming that supports human rights defenders who are fighting for change in their countries. So at Freedom House, we've been tracking 15 consecutive years of decline in global freedom in our annual Freedom in the World report. That means that in each of the past 15 years, more countries have declined in freedom than have improved. COVID-19, of course, has exacerbated that trend. we found that 36 countries and territories experienced a decline in freedom as a direct result of the pandemic. And these declines were not due to health concerns. They were due to manipulation of those concerns as an excuse to consolidate power. I'll give you a few examples. Azerbaijan, Tanzania, and other dictatorships used the pandemic as a pretext for cracking down on opposition activists. Cuba, Kyrgyzstan, and others targeted independent media that they've long had in their sights. Police in Argentina, Liberia, and other countries used excessive force when enforcing quarantine measures. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel delayed court proceedings against him. And arbitrary states of emergency were imposed in countries including Guinea, the Gambia, and Hungary. But the threats to democracy go beyond COVID. Really, no country is safe. We can protect our values at home, but the globalized world that we're in allows these dangers to reach across borders, and they threaten even the most free countries. Of course, Canada is among the most free countries in our measures. So I'm going to highlight 3 additional threats right now. First, there's the increase in China's power. The Chinese Communist Party is not only quashing freedom at home, but it's exporting repression to less authoritarian settings. For many years, the CCP has been systematically working to promote a favorable image of its model of repression with capitalism, and at the same time to undermine positive perceptions of democracy. I think the CCP's diplomacy over the past year of the pandemic is really indicative of this trend. Beijing engaged in a global campaign of disinformation and censorship once people realized that it had been covering up the scale of the health threat and the spread of COVID-19. It attempted to sway global opinion against the concept of democracy through efforts such as highlighting the failure of the US to control the virus while ignoring success stories like Taiwan. And meanwhile, democracy supporters have been losing or even simply engaged from the propaganda war, which means they are failing to convince people that democracy is in fact the best method for bringing sustainable peace and prosperity. I'll also note that the CCP is increasingly committing rights abuses abroad. It has been meddling more and more in domestic political discourse of foreign democracies, especially Australia, and that is spreading. And it is a lead offender when it comes to what we're calling transnational repression or the targeting of critics overseas. It has been undermining the human rights standards that had reigned in multilateral institutions like the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which gives itself more latitude for abuse. I'm going to speak now a bit more about this concept of transnational repression. Freedom House did a study called Out of Sight, Not Out of Reach that cataloged more than 600 cases over the past 5 years of governments reaching across national borders to silence dissent among their diaspora and exile communities. These cases were all forms of physical repression, things like kidnapping, unlawful deportation, or assassination. The biggest offenders were high-profile governments like China, Russia, and Iran, but there were also surprise cases like Rwanda. Our research shows that transnational repression has become a normal phenomenon, something that's taking place daily and is affecting thousands of people, and even millions if you count their families. So Jamal Khashoggi's case, which is very familiar, is part of what is actually a new and chilling trend in authoritarian tactics. The last threat that I'll mention is the failure to consolidate democratic gains that had been popping up over the past few years. If you think back to the mass protests that broke out across the world in 2019, Freedom House looked at what happened to those countries in 2020. We found that 39 countries and territories that had a major protest in 2019, of those 39, 23 of them saw their overall freedom decline the following year. That's 60% of protests, leading to a subsequent decline. So rather than being a cause for hope, protests appear to have been excuses for further repression. But I'll close by saying that despite all of this, I remain optimistic. And that's because as someone who's been doing this work for many years, I do see this year as different. The amount of interest in the threats to democracy and the discussions like the one we're having right now, the engagement of average citizens and policymakers dwarfs what we've seen maybe in decades. But we do need to capitalize on that interest and move toward democratic solidarity, vision, and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Over to Tom.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I can make a useful contribution. I've been asked to talk about how democracy assistance, democracy support should adapt to the new circumstances in which we're all living. I'd like to build upon Sarah's excellent remarks to widen a little bit our lens of what is this current political situation globally, and therefore how should we adapt. Sarah has emphasized the authoritarian gains that many authoritarian-minded governments have been carrying out in the past year and a half. And that's a very significant phenomenon that deserves a lot of study and attention. I'd like to call attention just very briefly to three other aspects of the current global political context, then turn to how democracy systems should adapt. In addition to the increasing spread of authoritarianism, we also have the increase in citizen anger. A big trend over the last 10 years was citizen anger about governance. Citizens are angry about four big things in many of their countries. They're angry about inequality, they're angry about incompetence, they're angry about corruption, and they're angry about political overreach by many political regimes. This anger, it manifests itself in an enormous surge of protests around the world over the last 10 years. The pandemic has only stepped up that anger in all the ways you can imagine you've read about. Another trend is increased polarization. There was some hope when the pandemic hit that countries that have been suffering toxic polarization, where two sides are really apart in a kind of toxic form of internecine struggle in a country in which political differences become rooted in social identities. There was some hope that the pandemic might bring such countries back together, a common enemy to fight, a neutral political enemy might build some bridges, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. Think about Brazil, the United States under Donald Trump, India. The temperature of politics has only been going up under the pandemic, not down. So polarization, which tears at the fiber of democracy in many places, has also been increasing. A fourth trend, the complex one, but it's definitely worth noting, is what I call the equalization of the political terrain. The old idea that there's a set of countries called established democracies that have largely solved their major democratic problems and are kind of working on the details. And then a set of countries, newer, struggling democracies that are grappling with fundamental challenges. That old division is gone. Democracies all around the world are struggling with many of the same problems. And therefore, the idea that there's a protected zone and a struggling zone has to be removed from our minds. And we have to think of democracy as a large terrain with a lot of similarities across, surprising sort of divisions that existed in the past. So what does this mean for democracy? It means several things. First, a much more pointed, thoughtful, and also forceful response to authoritarian gains. It means not seeing civil society and support for civil society as a nice kind of thing to do, pat them on the head, nice advocacy work, thank you. No, civil society is the heartland of democratic struggle in many countries. And it has to be the place where in many cases we put more assistance in a more pointed fashion and a more forceful fashion. In addition, democracies have to fight authoritarianism, have to have much more solidarity together. When one country like Canada takes it on the chin from China for having done something, in this case to help the United States with Huawei, they need to get support from other democracies, starting with the United States. So democracies need to work more together. More forceful responses to disinformation. Disinformation is spread like a poison through the democratic information spaces in many countries. And disinformation propagated in many cases by governmental actors seeking to do democracy ill. So first, a more forceful response than authoritarianism. Second, with respect to citizen anger, much greater attention to accountability. Accountability is what angry citizens want. They want to see anti-corruption, they want to see inclusion, they want to see competence. And so political accountability really needs to be at the fore of governance work. Not a nice detail, it needs to be the central thrust of what we're doing when we engage with governance systems and say, this is really the essential challenge for politics is accountability. On polarization, the democracy assistance community does not have a well-developed toolkit, if you will, for polarization. People are still getting their analytic minds around the challenge of when you go to a country and see it moving down the path of polarization. Indonesia is a good example of that, a country in the early stages of what looks like a spreading syndrome of toxic polarization. What should be the right response? Is it elite dialogues, citizen dialogues, institutional reform, media reform? The donor community has not gotten its game together with respect to combating polarization or helping unwind it. And then fourth, with respect to the horizontal nature of political challenges, this is a really big challenge for the democracy assistance community. We need to move away from the idea of democracy assistance as an export that some countries essentially sell or give to others, and instead, working to reform democracy, support democracy, needs to be thought of as a mutual learning endeavor that all democracies take part in, support each other, work across boundaries. That's going to mean a shift in the kind of institutional models of democracy support we give, but also the mindset of what we're offering, who we're engaging, how we're taking in, as well as putting out, and so forth. So these are all big adaptations, but they're necessary if we're going to meet the moment. Happy to talk more about these in the question and answer, and now turn it back over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Next, we move to Jennifer. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning from Los Angeles, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I was asked to center my remarks on women and feminist approaches to democracy assistance. So I'm going to dive right into that with 3 big points, and I hope that later we can connect all of the presentations into one. So why should those supporting democracy care about women's role? So democracy at its heart is a promise of fairness and equality. And so the political inclusion of women, as well as other marginalized groups, provides a signal for whether or not democracy is working. It's not the only signal, but it is a signal. And from my own research, we know that voters and citizens are more likely to perceive that institutions and the decisions that institutions make are more fair and legitimate when women are present on equal terms with men. So the absence of women communicates that something fishy is going on, since there's no ex-ante reason to believe that women are not as capable as men as carrying out the tasks of democracy. If women are not there, it could be due to historical discrimination and exclusion and a lack of opportunity. And it can also be because one of the things authoritarians do when they come to power is shut down spaces that are inclusive and remove women. So all of the processes that Sarah talked about are highly gendered, when women and other marginalized groups are often the first to lose their rights to political participation. So this argument for women's inclusion hinges on justice for women, that participation is an issue of justice and an issue of legitimacy of institutions. It's not an argument that women are magical unicorns whose presence will automatically make societies better, like ending war and bringing about peace. It's important to realize that arguments for women's inclusion that hinge on magical unicorn ideas hold women to unrealistic and double standards of transforming entrenched power structures, and then become weaponized against women when women are seen as failing to deliver. But second, I want to talk about some tensions between democracy assistance and women, and how a feminist democracy assistance can do better. So what we see from women's organizations and hear from women's organizations is that international support for women in politics is often structured around elections. So these are temporary programs and initiatives, and then programs tied to elections cannot do the work of long-term change and structural barriers and attitudes that prevent women from participating. For example, one of the latest trends in development is training programs for women candidates and women parliamentarians. These are deeply important. They create important spaces for women to connect, to network, to gain mentorship, to raise their visibility before party leaders and voters. But my research and the review of others' research also suggests that a focus on fixing women does not result in long-term changes, and that some of these programs reinforce perceptions that what's holding women back is women's deficiency in skills and not structures of power and inequality. So when women politicians are not in the media, it becomes read as women just need to learn to communicate better, not that journalists and the public need to become more accustomed to viewing women as authoritative voices. So we need to move away from fixing women and towards fixing systems that keep women and other marginalized groups out. If women matter for signaling the inclusivity and legitimacy of institutions, and they do, it's because voters and citizens perceive that inclusive institutions reach better decisions. So a feminist democracy assistance is not just about empowering individual women, though that absolutely matters. It's about transforming systems such that all have political voice and political influence, and that political voice and influence are not just available to the dominant groups in the country, but to the groups that are structurally and historically marginalized. And so a values forward approach emphasizes inclusion and diversity and access. Third, I want to talk about how COVID-19 has exposed some of the structural barriers that keep women and other marginalized groups out. One thing that we see when we look at COVID relief, and I think this is an illustrative case for democracy assistance more broadly, is that a lot of COVID relief is being delivered to grassroots women's organizations, and these grassroots women organizations are providing services and implementing programs. Again, these services are incredibly important to people that are suffering from the pandemic. But the same organizations that are providing services and that are implementing programs have no venues to translate what they are seeing in their communities back to domestic policymakers. Providing service is not the same as influencing policy. It is not the same as having power to influence policy. So we have to move beyond treating women's organizations merely as service providers and provide support that allows women's organizations to find their own voices, to influence policy, and to challenge patriarchal power structures. So building sustainable and inclusive recoveries, a key feature of Building Back Better, means going beyond service provision and focusing on empowering individuals and organizations to have political access. I want to add that as we move forward with politics and elections in a pandemic and post-pandemic world, there are going to be important gendered consequences of political work taking place in online and offline spaces. Women may be missing from certain spaces due to the barriers of participating online, digital gaps, and energy poverty. And they may be missing from in-person spaces because, unlike men, they may be unable to come back into public in-person spaces due to ongoing domestic caretaking responsibilities and ongoing concerns about being at risk for transmission. So a gendered lens takes on extra importance as political and electoral spaces shift in response to the pandemic. Finally, and relatedly, COVID-19 has laid bare that gender inequality will persist across the world so long as the gendered division of household labor persists. And I want to quote my colleague Don Teal, who has this lovely quote in an essay she wrote for a compendium we put together in the Boston Review. So long as working women bear the brunt of the emotional, physical, and cognitive labor in the home, women will never have the intellectual space or the free time to participate fully in politics. So I fully encourage democracy assistance to take seriously the domestic constraints on women's ability to participate in politics and think creatively about how aid cannot just fix women's deficiencies, but help women navigate structural barriers like care work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Over to Chris.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. And I really appreciate being invited to take part in this. I spent some time in democracy assistance in between all of my Canada-US work, and it really is important. I want to make just a couple of points, though, about where I think it could fit in to our Canada-US relationship. First, to dispel any myths, and I think, Tom, you're a good example. Canadians are already engaged in democracy assistance around the world. They work for a number of international NGOs, whether it's the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the International IDEA, the list goes on, and they do quite well. And having seen some Canadians in the field working firsthand, whether funded by the National Endowment for Democracy or USAID funds, or working with groups like the Institute for Multiparty Democracy in the Netherlands or the Westminster Foundation in the UK, Canadians often have that ability to be honest, not be American, and therefore not necessarily having that nationality muddle the message. Certainly in the years after the invasion of Iraq, the US effort to try to do nation building there led people to be suspicious of the US democracy training and its sincerity. And it was always helpful for us when we had Canadians who were carrying that message on, because it emphasized that this was something that democracies are trying to do to help those who are trying to create a democracy, and not just an extension of American hegemony. Now, not only have Canadians been involved on the front lines of this work for decades, but the government of Canada has on occasion funded some of these same international organizations to deliver programming in places that were really important to Canadian national interest. I think in particular of the Ukraine, also Haiti, where Canada wanted to make a difference. They wanted to invest in helping those societies develop the capacity to be governed and to govern themselves more democratically. And they turned to international organizations to deliver that service. Now, what I think is most important and the opportunity in the Canada-US relationship that sits in front of us is to give the government of Canada greater visibility in all this. So Canadians are already active and Canadian government is already investing here. So the question is really what's missing? To me, it's visibility, and not just visibility of having the Canadian brand on a particular leaflet or piece of information, but visibility with the US government. Because Canada and the United States largely share concerns about the quality of governance, both in our own societies and abroad. We want to help, and we have been doing so. But the visibility of Canada's effort, which could be enhanced by a creation of a national democracy fund, expansion of the democracy portfolio within Canada's own aid agency, would have the value of signaling, for those who don't know, that Canada and the US are on the same side, that we have common cause. And it's a bit of a trope in Canada-US relations that when presidents and prime ministers meet, they often talk about third country issues more than they talk about bilateral issues, because in some ways those third country issues are where an American president is looking for a point of view, a perspective maybe different from what he or she is hearing from staff. And I think Canada's role there is invaluable in countries in turmoil, helping the US to think creatively about what could get traction and how we could advance the cause of civil society and participation, as Jennifer was saying. So I also think now is a particularly appropriate time. Canada's aid agency has been talking about branding and how to leverage some of its outreach and investment to give Canadians the sense that what's going on abroad really is not only just happening, but happening with Canadian support. And I want to maybe address one thing to reassure even our cautious Canadian friends that this is a safe investment. Maybe I should just say cautious Government of Canada friends, because I know many who are that way. And that's just to underscore the durability of this effort. And while Tom Carothers is absolutely right, we have to think about what's unique about the moment, how we can adjust our strategies and adapt them to gain the traction that we badly need, because this is such an important mission. But taking a longer look, in many ways, the United States has carried forward its interest in supporting democracy abroad through the ups and downs of Democratic and Republican administrations. We always point to Ronald Reagan and his famous Westminster speech as giving rise to this business, at least this part of US foreign policy. But we saw this sustained through the George H.W. Bush years, the Clinton years, the George W. Bush years, where frankly, Iraq and other projects did cause, I think, a lot of people to wonder whether this was a neoliberal or a neoconservative, rather, initiative. We saw it carried on during the Obama years, and it's continued, even continued on the Trump years. And now we're in a new era. But having survived different change in the US administration, having survived the budget hawks in Congress who were looking to save money here and there, even having survived since 2016, the erosion of our own democratic best practice norms here in the United States, or at least where I'm sitting is in the United States, we still carry this mission forward. And I think for Canadian governments cautious, as I remember the Harper government was, about just how much to get involved in this business, I think the durability of the US commitment to democracy assistance is a powerful thing in itself, and should, notwithstanding what Tom says, we need to adapt and improve. I think we would be better off if we were adapting and improving together. And the US stands to gain a lot from Canadian engagement at a higher level and with a formal Government of Canada brand on it, if you put it that way. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Christopher. we're off to exactly the start that I had hoped. And so we've heard from our American friends now. This is a US-Canada dialogue, so now we'll hear some feedback from a Canadian and a global perspective from our commentator, Francesca Binda. Ms. Binda is the president of Binda Consulting and a parliamentary associate and a colleague and friend. She's a veteran of several political transitions over the last 25 years and has worked in dozens of countries worldwide on democracy support. And the floor is yours, Francesca, for some thoughts and reflections.
Thank you, Tom. And like Tom Cormier, as Chris noted, I'm one of the many Canadians who worked for one of the big American organizations for 20 years, implementing democracy programs. So I won't take a long time because I think this is a really important discussion for questions and answers and a dialogue. But from the speakers, what strikes me is that we have discovered because of COVID that institutions matter, and investing in institutions and how they're structured and governed really impacts how they respond to crises such as COVID. And Sarah's report for Freedom House noted that settings that already had weak safeguards against the abuse of power were suffering most during COVID. And that goes to the governance and accountability issue of institutions. You know, exclusive and opaque, corrupt institutions failed to protect the most vulnerable citizens during the pandemic. And Jen has talked about having women at the table, and we saw this time and time again during COVID responses. For instance, we worked with Libyan civil society organizations to do rapid assessments across the country at the end of last year, and many of them noted that the community COVID response committees had no women. And so the responses within the community failed to address issues that were vitally important to women, such as domestic violence, such as food security, mobility. And because these women did not have a seat at the policy table, the crisis responses reflected that lack of inclusive issues. So including women is, as Jen has said, not just the right thing to do, but it does make a difference in terms of responding to the crisis. Another thing that the speakers have talked about is civil society, and civil society matters. And civil society's organizations need to be partners in building and sustaining democracies, not just as beneficiaries of international assistance. And increasingly, we are seeing that civil society organizations are being creative and want to be participants in deciding on the democracy agenda for their countries. And Tom and his colleagues wrote for Foreign Affairs earlier this year on the questions facing the Biden administration for the Summit for Democracy, and put the question that the administration may have to face is, should they include non-governmental organizations, entities as invites to the summit? And in order not to be too unwieldy, the invite list is always a difficult decision-making process, but I don't see how they cannot be invited to the Summit of Democracies. And in fact, we know of civil society organizations in the MENA region and the Balkans who have already come together and started brainstorming about ways that they can be involved. And I think that we need to, if we're recognizing that civil society is important to democracy development and assistance, they need to be front and center for the Summit of Democracy. And just one more point about being a Canadian in democracy implementation. You know, Canada's experiences are obviously different than the United States. We have a multi-party political system. We have issues that others look to for guidance on experience on how to deal with it, not necessarily how to solve them, but how do we manage as Canadians political disputes on major issues such as identity and language and values. And when I was in the field implementing democracy programs, I would much rather share the experiences of a Canadian member of parliament or a member of provincial legislature even, because what she spends on her office, her staff, her activities is much less than a congressman or a senator. To compare the experiences of large countries like the United States is unrealistic for many legislators in developing countries and in emerging democracies. And finally, I think our challenge in democracy assistance is to keep the politics in democracy assistance. You know, democracy assistance is often thought of as the dark prince of professionals within the broader development community. And while the broader development community often turns their nose down at the democracy assistance because we don't build wells or dams or build schools, if there's no oversight or anti-corruption values within a community, sometimes building those schools and building those wells is for naught because they're not maintained and protected within the democratic structures. So I always ask people to please don't take the politics out of democracy assistance and trust that there's a reason that there's an arm's length relationship between donors and diplomats and implementers, because donors and diplomats cannot often be as political as implementers can be. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Francesca. A couple of reflections. Again, I'm so honored to have the chance to have these discussions and to also share them with the many folks that are watching us today. I'm struck as well by some of the things I heard clearly when we talk about the work that Freedom House has been doing on tracking trends over the last few years, and to really reflect on the fact that we are at a very important inflection point. So discussions like this are really needed, but also encourage that the fact that we're having these and recognize the value of doing it is something that instills optimism in an otherwise very difficult situation. I also want to reflect on, Tom mentioned the need for us to really think about how are we going to develop tools to respond to increasing polarization, but also rooting our efforts as democracy assistance providers in accountability, anti-corruption and inclusion initiatives, but also the notion that democracies need to stand together and to make sure that we acknowledge that it is no longer us against them, or them being those that are aspiring to be democracies, but we are facing challenges in real time together that we need to talk about. And from Jennifer, I really I appreciate the notion of the magical unicorn, and also the need for us to move away from fixing women to fixing institutions, and to make sure that we acknowledge the realities of the many hats women face, and to ensure that our expectations are managed, but also that we recognize the immense value of work that happens that is often unseen and unpaid. And it's certainly important as we all are trying to deal with responses to the pandemic. It is absolutely crucial that those that are most affected are at the table when decisions are made, and that's clearly a call to action for us to make sure that programming in response to the pandemic make sure that there's inclusivity in responses of government, and that we acknowledge that as democracy assistance providers, to make sure that we can ensure the institutions are prepared for that reality and also encourage it. And from Chris, you know, the cautious Canadian approach, I think it's important to recognize that there are opportunities here for Canada, opportunities to make sure that our approaches, because they do enjoy support from all parties, certainly that we speak to, that's acknowledged, and we understand and appreciate that democracy support can outlive governments, and it can be a constant in a foreign policy toolkit that can stand the test of time. I do want to start the questions. We've got a few already brewing in the chat, but if I could ask our speakers if they had, based on what we've heard and the reflections thus far, if you have 2 or 3 recommendations on what democracy assistant actors can do to adapt and to the current challenges and learn from COVID-19 in the way that we design and deliver our programming. Should we go in the same order if we can? I'll ask Sarah to start out. Thank you.
Sure, Tom. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done. First, I'll back up this idea that democratic governments really do need to come together. I think they need to present a positive vision for how democracy can address people's everyday concerns, which are generally around financial and physical security. And they also need to present a united front against this authoritarian expansion. I think this can be done in the high-profile events like the Democracy Summit, but we also all need to roll up our sleeves and do the day-to-day work of designing mutually reinforcing diplomatic strategies, investing in overseas programming for democratic resilience and other cooperative activities. Democracies can safeguard against repression on their own territory by closing loopholes that dictators use to target their dissidents, such as misuse of Interpol and illegal deportations. And they can also support struggling freedom fighters around the world in places like Ethiopia, Armenia, Hong Kong. And emphasizing democracy strengthening programs in foreign assistance is really important. One example is providing civil society and social movements with technical assistance and training on things like building coalitions, organizational development, and how to operate safely, both physically and digitally in the world that we're in. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. Tom, any pearls of wisdom, recommendations?
Well, I try to give just one sort of overarching idea that I think needs to be pursued. As the pandemic has laid bare so many different governance problems in countries, the rising inequality, the differential gender effects, the differential racial effects, the governance incompetence, the political posturing and charades that some leaders have undertaken. Yet as we at least hopefully start to move to a post-pandemic era, of course, the temptation is going to be, let's just rush back to normal. Oh, if we could just go back to the way we were. And I fear that we're going to lose the moment in terms of taking stock of what were the liabilities that were so exposed, and what is a post-pandemic agenda that's not going back to normal, but going back to something genuinely different and better. We use the concept of greater resilience, which I think is a good starting point, but we need to really flesh it out and say, what are the 4 or 5 major debilities that were highlighted that need to be addressed by countries themselves, but also by the democracy support community. So the democracy support community perhaps provides countries the opportunities to do that kind of stock taking, maybe bring some together to work on, their own stock taking, compare notes, and come up with a sense of an agenda coming out of this that can then be supported with new priorities that citizens would really respond to and feel that they're being listened to. So I think the post-pandemic moment is really critical, and I know in myself the feeling of just go back to normal. But I stop and think, what have we learned? We've been hit in the face with many problems. Let's keep our attention to them and try to move beyond that in a very serious and focused way.
Excellent. Thank you. Over to Jennifer.
Great. I'll mention 2, one building on my presentation and one new. So first, I think actors providing support for democracy, when they identify partner organizations, civil society organizations, it's about supporting those organizations in pursuing their goals, not choosing the goals for the organization. So when intervention can be aligned on shared values, but the organizations themselves articulate what their goals are and are empowered to pursue their goals. And I think second, I didn't mention this, but we know for any individuals engaged in democracy work in their home countries, but particularly for women and other structurally marginalized social groups, these can be high-risk contexts. So we know that women and members of other structurally marginalized groups are more likely to experience violence online, in person, threats, harassment, and assault for their democracy work. And I think the international community has a very important role to play in accompanying these individuals, in helping countries develop protections to guard against online and in-person violence, threats, and assaults that democracy activists and proponents experience when they participate.
Thank you, Jennifer. Christopher.
This is a tricky one for me. I know that over the years, the Canada and the United States have both participated in things like the Community of Democracies and other groups to talk about the quality of governance. But we're at the beginning of well, we just had a G7 summit in which Britain and other countries are talking about a D10, a group of leading democracies. And I think that's good. I understand why the Biden administration has taken the support, but I think it's important for us to be more inclusive on that. If joining the 10 means you're a democracy and a reasonably successful one, then why stop at 10? If you really are Western countries opposed to Russia and Chinese actions, why label that a democracy club? In the sense that we could find ways not to muddle the message. I think there's a broad agenda here, and it includes a lot of different things. We have to be careful how we're using the terms and what we're appropriating that term democracy for, which is not to tell politicians they can't use the word. I'm just saying that I think we face a different challenge if world leaders pivot democracy versus non-democracy as the dividing line, particularly if we're going to find ourselves in a new Cold War with China or anyone else. That I think will not only deter some countries from making the move towards more accountable and democratic government, it may also make some of our smaller democracies or our halfway democracies feel that they've been excluded because they're just not important enough. All of those debates, I think, muddy the waters. So caution, that's all I had. And I was just picking on the Canadians for being cautious. So here I am advising caution. Clearly they've rubbed off on me.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. Lot of questions coming up in the Q&A, and I'll remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A, which I think should be to the right rather than the chat. It'll help make sure we can see them properly. Let's start out. I've got a question here from Cynthia Wagner, who asked about election monitoring, saying it's a great way to involve citizens in democracy development projects. Hard fact, the government of Canada has been investing less and less towards sending Canadians to monitor elections and democracy development since 2015. How can the gap between the rhetoric, that is, Team Canada supports democracy development, and concrete actions, that is, Government of Canada return to supporting election monitoring missions, how can that be bridged? Anyone willing to talk about election observation, election in an international context? Good thing, Chris. I see.
I do think it's a good thing, but it's often been framed as a kind of tutelage. We, the established democracies, are going to go oversee an election someplace and either stamp it as free and fair or not. And I would love to see election monitoring become as normal as sending somebody to participate in the inauguration of a new leader after an election. We celebrate the aftermath, but it shouldn't be seen as, I think, many Americans see it as something you do for developing countries that they would never do here. And the last couple of elections, and we've had some rough ones in the US, there's been this sense that, oh, well, the Germans and others will send election monitors because we're such a mess that they need to, and immediately like, well, we're a big country. We don't need these people telling us what to do. I think we need to just shift the norm and say that celebrating the process as well as the outcome is a normal thing for friendly foreign countries to do. And to put this on the US and Canada, I think we need to open ourselves more to the idea that other countries may want to send monitors just to see how we're doing, maybe not to judge us, but to pick up some tips and perhaps advise us a little bit. I think that would be the more appropriate way to have it, less from the great to the low, and more we're all in this together.
Thanks.
So
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah,
Liz?
there are a couple of things that I would say about this. And the first is, if all you're doing with free and fair elections is at the end with election monitoring, you've missed the boat. You need to start in the run up to elections and look at what's going on in the media space, look at what's going on in the civil society space, look at freedom of association assembly and how the government is doing that. So you need to start there. And then election monitoring is a little bit the cake topping, right? And there, I know that Canada and the United States, we support OAS monitoring, we support OSCE. The UN doesn't do too much of this because the UN member states are more active about what they will tell the UN they can and can't do. We do actually have monitors from time to time come to the United States, and that's always an interesting challenge to work with our state governments and local governments who sometimes have the kind of reaction that Christopher described. But most of the time, they'll say, "Oh, okay, whatever," and let folks come in. But you're all right that we should be modeling, the kind of behavior that friendly governments do. And election monitoring is not a threatening thing. So I agree with you on that 100%.
Excellent. Thank you. Jen Welch, Maxime Poulain, and Laura Thornton are all asking questions about the polarization issue raised by Tom. But I guess the question is, any advice? Are there any lessons or effective ways to engage on this very tough issue, since you've put it on the table and it seems to have sparked a response among many? Tom?
Sure, happy to address that. I wish I could just lay out for you a nice how-to guide, and then I wish we could apply it to the United States and start getting on a better path. I mean, our country is just caught in a terrible cycle of toxic polarization that's taking us on a very dark road, somewhere not good. But there are things that countries are starting to learn to do, and I think we as a community can start to, as I said, kind of up our game. Let me just give 3 examples. One is some countries that are in early stage, and you can see the problem starting to metastasize and to get really dangerous, but they don't realize it yet because they haven't been down the road before. Indonesia is one example of one. Just in the last 2 years, Indonesia has started to become much more polarized in dangerous ways. Going in early there to call attention to the path that it's on and maybe bring people from other very polarized countries and say, here are the symptoms, here's what we see, here's why this is dangerous, this is what's going to happen next. Now you're showing intolerance of opposition. Guess where that leads? Now you're taking this approach or that approach. And so earlier interventions to get countries, people within them, activists, political actors and others, aware of what's happening in order to begin to address it. The second is opposition strategies. There's starting to be some learning about what kinds of opposition strategies are most effective when you're facing a leader who is governing by polarizing. Donald Trump was governing by polarizing. He woke up every day and tried to polarize the country more. That's the only way he knew how to handle any issue, was to polarize. He still does it today. Read his statements today about Liz Cheney, calling her a bitter, horrible person, and then lots of capital letters following. When you're governing by polarizing, opposition is tricky. Think of the different ways that Donald Trump could have been combated in the electoral campaign, and think of Biden's approach, how effective it was not to rise to the bait, simply to stay on target, stay on message, and then keep moving forward with a positive message. In other cases, oppositions have slipped into a divisive approach that sort of meets fire, offers fire to fire, and then you get the negative cycle. And then third, dialogue efforts. There's a lot of dialogue efforts out there, citizen dialogues, elite dialogues, and our learning on dialogues is only really starting to emerge. It's easy to say, oh, if we only get people together in a room for a weekend and talk to each other, they'll learn their differences aren't so much. Actually, research shows when you do that, they learn that their differences are serious and they like each other less in many cases. Unless you run the dialogue in thoughtful ways that take are cognizant of that danger. So no magic solution, but we're starting to see points of entry of how, when to intervene, and what kinds of strategies to offer and have learning about, and what other kinds of efforts. I could go on, but I just wanted to give a flavor for it. In fact, I'm working with Jennifer McCoy at Georgia State University, doing some new work. Jennifer's doing a major project looking at overcoming polarization in a number of cases around the world in the last 50 years, and we're going to be bringing that research into Carnegie and highlighting it and trying to disseminate a bit more lessons about how to address polarization.
Thanks, Tom. And I would just say on May 26th, our next series or our next discussion will focus on the issue of radicalization, and there likely will be some opportunities to discuss that further, so stay tuned for that. Stephanie Plant asks a question to Jen or Tom. What are the biggest threats to democracy in the US versus abroad? Are the issues the same?
I'm happy to have Jen take that easy question.
You know, I do think that there are really common threads. So we've mentioned the disinformation, and I think we have to take disinformation very seriously. And I think we have to consider that disinformation not just foments political violence, as we've seen, for instance, in the case of the United States and the Latin American cases that I'm familiar with, but I think we have to think of disinformation as, in fact, a weapon that anti-democratic actors are using to undermine democracy, and that it is even harmful for its recipients. Disinformation, especially disinformation that targets women, that's undermining particularly women's faith in the vaccines, that's converting women to these various QAnon causes. I mean, it is targeting people and their vulnerabilities and their worst fears. It is overriding their rational faculties and radicalizing them to these far-right causes. So I think disinformation is a problem. I want to build on Tom's comments about polarization. Polarization, you know, those who talk about democracy say a challenge with polarization, right, is that you start to think about your political opponents, not just as somebody with whom you disagree, but as with your enemies that must be vanquished, right? And so the tenor ratchets up. But I think it would be naive to say, well, we just need to ratchet that tenor down, because an element of the backlash that we're living in right now across the globe, the backlash towards the expansion of political and social rights for different groups, is that people now say the quiet parts out loud. So how do we ratchet the tension down when my political opponent and I just don't disagree about taxes, but we disagree about who counts as a human being? We disagree about who counts as someone who should receive rights, protections, and benefits from the state. And so I think we have to also start drawing clear lines about what can be in and what can be out. And I know that's hard because I myself talked about democracy as inclusive, deliberatory, and participatory spaces. But I am sympathetic to those for whom it is difficult to break bread, not with just someone with whom you disagree with on technical policy issues, but with someone who doesn't think that your group, whether it's your religious group, your gender, your sexual identification, that your group doesn't have a right to exist in the polity. And I think we have to be really clear about what is at stake in some of these conversations and not be naive that it's simply about coming together and finding common ground.
Anything to add there? Are we moving? Okay.
Could I add one additional threat?
Absolutely, may, Sarah, please.
So I think the threats to democracy in most countries are domestic, but there are these common themes globally, which is, I mean, I agree with what everyone has said. And another one that I would say, in addition to polarization that was briefly mentioned, is inequality. And we face that here. I think it's a huge threat to our democracy here, but it's also such a threat to democracy in so many other countries. And the fact that in so many countries now, people see their leaders as taking care of the elite and not of the rest is a huge factor in undermining trust in democracy, but also in having the kind of solidarity that you need in order to have a system where sometimes the other side is going to win, and you need to be okay with that because someday your side will win. And the way that democracy works is not possible if we don't all buy into the system as a whole.
Thanks.
Can I just jump in on two related points? One is, I think that one of the reasons we've become so polarized is that too much is considered in the purview of government. Civil society can do a lot of really good things. And we've tended to focus so much on the big political battles that it's come at the detriment, at least in Western societies, of some of the civil society activism we used to have and see as a legitimate part of the process. The second thing is, and I hope I won't embarrass our host, but I do think this is an area where Canada has a useful story to tell. I've known a lot of Canadian prime ministers, opposition leaders, and so on, and they certainly will go toe to toe in question period and so forth. But I'm always struck that what differentiates Canadian politics at the high level and even in the provincial level from what I'm used to in the United States is there's competition, but no one thinks the other side is the embodiment of evil in the modern world. It isn't always friendly, but there's a kind of civility or respect for the other and that we're all playing in a game. That's a great Canadian quality. And I think if we could just bottle it, we could just export that would be great. But anyway, we could learn a little bit from that Canadian civility to our benefit.
Thank you. Let me go back to the questions. Bob Miller asks, we've acknowledged obviously Canadians working through other international organizations, but he's asking us to emphasize the importance of building and drawing upon Canada's institutional capacity to do this work through civil society organizations such as the Parliamentary Centre and others. Any suggestions regarding the best way to build Canadian capacity in supporting democracy in Canada and internationally? I'll throw that open to any takers.
I'll start just by noting, we have a great many conversations with our Canadian colleagues in Global Affairs Canada about doing this work and how to do this work. And I have to note sort of at the outset that they do a great job with the resources that they have. Far be it from me as a representative from the United States to say spend more money, that would be inappropriate. Although I will note that particularly during the Trump presidency, Congress responded by spending more and more money on democracy issues abroad, which I thought was an interesting domestic reaction to what we saw. So I think Canada has the ability, they have the capacity to work in these areas. There may be a resource question, which a parliamentary group might be well placed to help with.
Tom, if I could, I would just add to that. Thank you, Len, that, it really doesn't hurt to have an institution solely dedicated to the task. Even if it's not the main part of what you do, the budget of the National Endowment for Democracy is just over 10% of what the US aid agency spends on democratic development. But everybody focuses on the net often abroad, like, oh, the United States is out there, doing this because it's called the Endowment for Democracy, whereas USAID does a lot of things in the world. It does health, it does education, et cetera. So having something that's branded, it leverages the reputation of a country much more than the actual budget of the organization, simply by the fact that it's dedicated. Then the second thing I would say, and so it's an investment that can't be measured easily just in dollar terms. Then the second thing I would say is Canada does have some really particular strengths, not just what Chris talked about very wisely is the civility and so forth, but also the inclusiveness, the struggles for inclusion and the struggles of ethnic inclusion, linguistic, et cetera, other kinds of inclusion, advances in LGBTQ rights in Canada. There is a particular Canadian inclusiveness and toleration that needs to be, which the United States is a little short on these days, as are a number of other countries. And so Canada needs to find a niche, not a small niche, a medium to big size niche and say, this is where our strength is. And we're going to connect our civil society, Canadian civil society, to this venture. So we're going to connect what goes on, at the Canadian domestic level to what's going on elsewhere. So those would be just a couple of points I would make.
Thank you. Seth Ashiagbor from NDI asks, a big challenge with democracy support is the demand for quick wins to justify continued returns on investment in addressing long-standing and very complex issues. Any new ideas and learning on this from panelists? It's an age-old question indeed.
So I really want to give a shout out to some of the organizations in the feminist international consultancy space, like Ladysmith. They've done a lot of creative thinking on this. And the punchline is that we have to, I encourage, right, donors, whether they are public or private, to really think about not just the demand for the quick wins, but how we measure those quick wins. Because often it's about a quantitative driven assessment. And we know that when assessment is quantitatively driven, certain things are left off the table. So the organizations working in the feminist space have really pushed for multi-method, qualitative and quantitative forms of assessment that look at accountability, not just in the immediate term, but in the long term. Right? Because I think that this question is so true, because the quick win logic has, for instance, reduced really important gender mainstreaming initiatives. And I actually want to highlight a strength of Canada is that Canada is one of the countries that applies a gender mainstreaming lens across the federal government in a really progressive way that I think they can continue to build on internationally. But the focus on quick wins, reduces everything to, well, let's just make sure that we have 50-50 women and men at the table. I'm the first person to say you need 50-50 women and men at the table, but that can't be your final metric of success. So it's really about the organizations that are giving the money and that are looking for the accountability for how their money is spent. Absolutely fair, but I really encourage them to think about qualitative and quantitative measures of success, because perverse incentives are created when it's only the quantitative assessment that's used and when it's the demand for a quick return on the investment.
Thank you. Okay. A couple that are similar. We have a question from Dr. Ali Al-Masoud from the Iraq Embassy here in Ottawa, as well as Max Cameron, centering on individual liberties. Max asks, what do we do when individual liberties hinder our ability to act collectively to do things like control a pandemic? Many established democracies have struggled to mobilize their citizens for the common good. Should we not also worry about the loss of collective liberties, that is, our capacity to work together and create healthy societies caused by the lack of state capacity, political polarization, and loss of social cohesion? And Dr. Al-Masoudi asks, in light of the challenges resulting from the pandemic, what are the guaranteed ways to preserve democracy and not to abuse power, especially for newly democratic regimes? Any thoughts for those? Tom Carothers has.
Yeah, if I could address at least the first question. It's a good question. I think we do have to be careful in looking at different pandemic responses from different countries, and be careful with the idea that lots of liberties means inability for a collective response. Because what we see is, both the United States and, say, South Korea have a lot of freedoms. But if you read about the collective mobilization in South Korea to combat the pandemic, it's really impressive. And so it isn't the fact that there are a lot of liberties that makes collective mobilization difficult. It has to do more with public trust in the government and the nurturing over time of a sense of common purpose in a society. And again, I hate to bring it up again, this lack of really toxic polarization that drives people apart. And then on the flip side, we tend to think, well, authoritarian countries, they can really, coerce people and mobilize them. Well, you look at Russia, which is quite authoritarian. Russia's had a tremendously lackadaisical response to the pandemic. Very high death rate, which has been camouflaged by Russian deception about its death rate. But the Russian population is so cynical about governance, so demobilized by its disempowerment, that they don't want to get vaccinated because they don't trust the vaccine. Russia is, able to export its vaccine more than it's able to give it to its own people. So A, we shouldn't assume that democracies are unable to mobilize people because of their liberties, other factors. And B, we shouldn't assume that authoritarian governments are able to mobilize their people because they're not automatically just because of the lack of liberties.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I want to build on that a little bit. I think it is true that trust in government and trust in establishment has been eroded, and one of the consequences, or I guess one of the natural responses to that, is that I think sometimes politicians in all of our countries, but certainly I can say for the U.S., look to hide behind an authority that has maybe more trust than they do. When it works, it's great. You think about President Eisenhower when he was dealing with the busing issue, saying, the Supreme Court's spoken, and I'm going to defer to that. But I think in COVID times, a lot of politicians have hidden behind public health experts And, which is not to say that expertise is invaluable, but I think there's a role for the politician who holds experts to account and makes judgments based on the best interest of the collective and is then elected or not elected the next time they're up. That's a function too. And I used to say war is too important to be left to the generals, and I think health is too important to be left to the doctors. I won't say anything about who my personal doctor is. I don't want to name him, but he's a bit of an authoritarian. I think sometimes that's how public health people view the world, but our democracy has leaders that we elect, and occasionally we agree, occasionally don't agree. It's similar to the way we talk sometimes about finances, that there's an accountant or a bank president who says, well, this is exactly what's going to happen if you continue to deficit spend. Those are considerations, but the job of politics, especially in a democracy, is to weigh those out against each other, to make a decision and then be held accountable for it. And to the extent that we allow ourselves to allow our leaders to sort of hide behind authority figures or experts without bringing in their role, I think we're weakened by that, because then it only perpetuates the lack of trust in government. And soon we don't trust experts either. And it's just anarchy, well, or could be. And I think that's the result. That is the consequence of a lot of people's alienation from our political institutions in the West, at least in the US.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tom mentioned Russia in a previous response. There is a question from Bob Miller asking us, how should we engage with authoritarian adversaries, Russia, China, in discussions regarding democratic governance? It's a tricky one. Any thoughts on what we can do as we see the gulf widening?
I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, the first is we have to be extremely realistic about what the goals of these countries are. And you heard panelists talk about actions that have been undertaken to undermine human rights standards. We see similar action being taken to try to control internet governance, for example. And those are areas where that's an argument we have to win. I mean, and that full stop, that's all there is to that. On human rights standards, and that's an area where democracies need to work together and stand up together and push back on degradation of human rights standards internationally. That's something we have to do. We have to collaborate on it. And the United States has come back into the UN Human Rights Council. We've announced our candidacy and hope to win. Please encourage your government to vote for us. Yes. But on things like that, you have to understand that we're not going to agree with the Russias and the Chinas. So you also then need to try to support individuals within those countries who are trying to make a difference, who are trying to tell the truth about things like Xinjiang, for example. You need to expose that to other countries so they understand, what the game is, to the best of your ability, and to call on civil society allies, who are interested in this area, who are oftentimes seen as a more objective voice than the government of the United States or other governments, to speak up and to speak to, their allies and other countries as well.
Okay. There's a comment from Erin Andrews, where she states multiple panelists are landing on how we have to ensure as democracy assistance providers that the people most effective need to be at the table when decisions are made. What about in discussions like this one? Should the countries we're discussing not be represented here and inform the conversation about how best to support democracy in their own context? I would answer definitively yes. This is, the start of a discussion. It is a U.S.-Canada discussion, but the question for us, I guess, is how the U.S. and Canada can do a better job of bridging those countries into the conversation. We have this new platform, Global Democracy Dialogues, which we hope to achieve just that by expanding the conversation to involve people from a wide variety of countries and regions that can help us stimulate the discussion and reflection necessary to make sure that we can provide the best advice to Canada and to other democracy assistance providers on how to be good partners in this pursuit. There would to a question from Marc Lemieux, who asked, do Americans feel a need for Canada to have a principled partner in Ottawa to promote democracy abroad?
We have principled partners in Canada to promote democracy abroad. I mean, I probably haven't said enough about Global Affairs Canada and the work that they do, but they do tremendous work. You know, there are Canadian NGOs that do tremendous work. I understand the Canadian humility, but be a little bit less humble here. You guys do fantastic work.
Okay. Prachi, a question for Sarah Repucci. Tom Carothers mentioned the trend of equalization, horizontalization among democracies. Given that Freedom House is best known for ranking and evaluating democracies, how are you thinking about the emerging horizontal environment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're the first to see it, right? Because we see how there may have been 30, 40 years ago, a kind of a Western preponderance of democracies. And of course, that's not the case anymore. You know, if you look at the top ranking democracies, they're quite diverse and all over the world. And so I do think it relates back to a lot of what's been said about us understanding that, you know, this isn't about the United States or Western democracies having some kind of model that we can spread across the world, but that this is an endeavor that we're all in together, that we can all learn from each other. And especially as major democracies have been slipping backwards in our scores and in their democratic performance in general, what can they learn from countries that have struggled with that before and have lessons for how to reclaim their democracy and how to reestablish it? And those examples come from very diverse countries in all parts of the world. So I think it's that mutual learning and also just a sense of humility and seeing that, you know, that we're not better and that democracy is never an endpoint, that it's not something that you achieve and then you have, and now you don't have to worry about it anymore. And that goes for us, but that goes for everybody. And so we're all in this together.
Tom, I might mention that Sarah's being a bit modest. She's the author of a terrific short report that Freedom House recently did examining US democratic challenges and shortcomings that really takes a hard look at the United States. Freedom House doesn't just, quote, evaluate others, it evaluates democracy everywhere it's found. And that includes the United States, and they're very honest about doing so.
Okay. Our time is running to an end here, but there is a question though that I think is important to put on the table. Niroshana Chaminda asks or says that the U.S. has a strong democracy arm, namely through USAID, to promote democracy in other countries, but I don't see such a mechanism for Canada. Any plan for Canada to introduce a strong institution? Is this advisable, or can Canada expand the work of the Parliamentary Centre? Any thoughts on that from our panelists about the need for Canada to have a more defined democracy assistance provider that could channel this work more effectively?
Let me jump in and maybe link that question with the comment from Sarah and also from Jennifer earlier about, I guess for lack of a better word, peer review. As we've integrated Canada and the US, we've seen more and more examples of the US and Canada sort of formally learning from each other. I'll just give you two examples. One being, we now have a cooperation with the Food and Drug Administration and Canada's Health Products and Food Branch, so that when new pharmaceuticals, including, although we waived some of the clinical trials for COVID drugs in a rush to get the vaccine out, in general, we will use Canadians to take a look at the same files, and we shuffle the peer review so that we can actually have more eyes on the file and expedite a result. Similarly, we have some programs through a military coordination committee and the Permanent Joint Board on Defense to share notes on big defense acquisitions. So I feel like some of this work is best judged by people who've been in the field and have the humility of knowing how hard it is. And there may be a way that to support Canadian efforts, the US groups and Canadian groups can find a platform or common ground to provide peer review for each other's efforts in this area, what's working, what's not working, and create a broader dialogue for the exchange of best practice, because I think we can learn from each other. Maybe you have to start that conversation with a little support, but there's tremendous ability for us to learn from what Canada has tried, and vice versa.
Any other thoughts? There is another question that I would be interested in some thoughts on. When looking at institutions, democratic institutions, are there examples of what institutions have been the most effective at ensuring good governance and accountability? What should the focus of our efforts be on in terms of institutions?
I'll jump in. I'd say the judiciary, the media, independent media, and civil society. And they're both the ones that are most effective at holding those in power to account, but also the ones who are first to get attacked. And so they're the ones who are most in need in a struggling democracy for support.
Good.
I've been thinking in some response to some of these questions about some of the lessons that we've taken away from the work we've done at UN Women, trying to understand which countries responded to COVID more effectively, which initially could have been about containing mortality and now is about a broader set of measures related to public health, vaccine distribution, economic recovery. And what's really striking about the countries that are doing well is that they don't map onto democracies neatly. They don't map onto global north, global south divides neatly. They don't map onto rich and poor countries neatly. And I think there's a whole separate conversation, but there's some things that it seems in the capacity of countries to do well, whether they are rich or poor, whether they're developed or undeveloped. And so one thing that we noticed was that countries that had consistent, impartial, and transparent institutions did particularly well. So what does that mean? It means your public bureaucracy treats citizens equally, that everyone has a fair chance and fair treatment when they interact with the public bureaucracy, whether that's getting a driver's license or obtaining public health, right? And that's in the reach of countries to do, no matter their resources. The other thing we noticed was strong investments in social protection were really important for building trust and addressing some of the citizen anger issues that Tom and others led off with. And again, strong social protection that's impartially and fairly administered is not just about economic capacity, it's also about choices and priorities. And in the pandemic, we actually saw that less wealthy countries actually made very strong investments early on in social protection. It wasn't just the wealthy countries that did it. In fact, the wealthy countries often did less. So I think we can also start thinking creatively about breaking down some of these binaries around rich and poor, global north and global south, and having learning that crosses these traditional boundaries and recognizing that there are capacity issues that can be managed and there are goals that can be achieved by a variety of different countries.
Thank you, Jennifer. Look, it's time that we have to wrap it up. I do want to thank again the US Embassy in Ottawa for the support to this, our panelists for sharing very important, thought-provoking comments. To remind you that our friends at the Center for International Policy Studies at Ottawa U, check out their blog in the coming weeks, where they're going to dig a little deeper on what we've heard, as well the Global Development Primer podcast. There's a link that will be sent in the chat. They will be interviewing. There's a great interview with Tom Carothers. Check it out, and they will interview other speakers as we move forward in this series. I do want to thank immensely Gabrielle Bardal for her leadership on this issue, on this series, as well the support of Nick and Stefan and all of our crew at the Parliamentary Center, and for everyone else out there around the world that has taken the time to tune in, to ask some great questions, and to prove what we thought was that there is a need for this dialogue, and it'll continue both in this series, but again, we will bring other continents, other countries, other academics and other thinkers together through this platform. So thank you once again on behalf of the Parliamentary Centre. Have yourselves a great day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This was really fun and good and informative.
And I'll go with that.